In his racist tweets attacking a group of Democratic Congresswomen of color on Sunday, President Trump invoked a highly charged phrase. The president told the four women to, quote, go back to the places from which they came. He stood by those comments today, saying, quote, it's my opinion they hate our country. The four Congresswomen, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Rashida Tlaib, Ayanna Pressley, and Ilhan Omar, are all American citizens. Only Congresswoman Omar was not born in the U.S. But telling Americans to go back home is not a new insult. It was used throughout the 20th century. As the Washington Post explains, there is hardly any ethnic or racial group in the country that hasn't been told to go back where they came from. In collections of voices from the Japanese American internment camps of the World War II era, in diaries of the earliest Italian and Irish immigrants, in Jewish novels and memoirs from the turn of the 20th century, the slur is a mainstay. For more on the history of this phrase, I want to bring in Douglas A. Blackmon. He is a historian and the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of Slavery by Another Name, the re-enslavement of Black Americans from the Civil War to World War II. He comes to us from Atlanta. We also still have Antjuan Seawright with us in Washington. Douglas, I'd like to start with you. You told the New York Times, quote, the president has moved beyond invoking the obvious racial slanders of 50 years ago, cliches like black neighborhoods on fire, and is now invoking the white supremacist mentality of the early 1900s when anyone who looked not white could be labeled as unwelcome in America. Give us some context. What was happening in the early 1900s that sparked this rhetoric of telling Americans to go back or go home?
Well, the amazing thing about so much of this is that all through the 1800s, all through the 19th century, America was a completely open immigration, open borders country. There were almost no laws or rules that prohibited anybody from coming to the United States, partly because there was such a broad understanding that that was the nature of the society that was being built here, and the need for new blood and new workers and new people to settle land and build the country. So it's not until the late 1800s, the early 1900s, that there begin to be laws passed that are restrictive of immigration, and those laws all were associated with various anxieties of the majority population. So the first ones were directed at Asians when there began to be large numbers of Asians, and particularly the Chinese and later the Japanese, arriving on the West Coast. But that came to be known as the Yellow Peril that needed to be stopped. At other times, there were terms when other ethnicities would be referred to as the Turban Peril, referring to Indians and Southeast Asians. And then, of course, when you get into a little later into the 20th century, people began to identify Italians and Greeks and all sorts of Southern Europeans as not being white. And it depended on the mood of the day whether ethnic groups were going to be labeled as being white or not, and whether they were welcome or not.
So I just want to go back to something you said a moment ago. So essentially, you said early on, this was a nation of open borders, something that is seen as very much, in some circles, pejorative today. But the fact that you have some folks today who will say, my ancestors came over legally, the immigration laws were nowhere near what they are today, is what I hear you saying.
Oh, yeah, there were no laws at all until the 1880s. That's when the very first restrictions of any kind are imposed. And even then, there's almost no legal barrier to anyone other than the Chinese arriving in the United States. And anybody who got to the U.S. during most of the 19th century, once you had remained in the country for 2 years, you could become a citizen through a very simple kind of process. Now, that's not to suggest that the issues aren't different today. At that time, through most of the 19th century, the Mexican border was nowhere near where it was today, and the number of people living in the area that is now occupied by the Mexican border is radically different. But yes, we were a wide open country, and certainly the stories that we all know pretty well just from our own understanding of cultural history about giant immigrant Italian populations and families in New York City, and the arrival of different groups from Europe in that period of time, and the arrival of the Irish before the Civil War and after the Civil War, stories that are often talked about in very romantic ways, like you were just referring to. Well, those were all the product of a time in which there was wide open immigration and very easy access to citizenship. But then also, at a certain point, when there were stresses in the society and economic difficulties, there began to be attacks on particular ethnic groups and immigrant groups that sounded a lot like the way the president has chosen to begin talking now, primarily about Hispanics.
So let me turn to you, Antjuan, because I also feel obviously it's very important to note here that when it comes to African Americans today, this term "go back" also has resonance because there is history there as well. There were times when there were movements in this country to get people who were freed slaves to go back to Africa, essentially. And this is very much something that's part of American history as well, Antjuan.
Well, just for context, I oftentimes remind people that I am the grandson of sharecroppers. I'm a first generation college student, only a second generation high school graduate. And so I lived through hearing my grandparents tell stories of how they were treated like second-class citizens in their day, how they were told to go back to their neighborhoods, go back to their side of town, how they were told they could not have or do certain things that people who did not look like them can do. And so when I hear this rhetoric from the president, when I see that hate crimes are on the rise, when I see that people are unapologetic about being racist, bigots, and they want to put hatred in the bloodstream of this country, it reminds me of conversations I had with my sharecropping grandparents before they died. And the scary part about all of this, it seems like we're living in times we've seen before. When you look at the fact that we're still having conversations about voter suppression laws, and people still in this country attend segregated schools, and housing seems to still be an issue for people of color, and some of the conversations and rhetoric we hear out of the modern day Republican Party, it seems as if we're going full steam backward in this country, and that's not a safe space or a safe place for us to be as the country who's supposed to be the leaders of the free world. And so all of this, it sends chills up my body. It pisses me off like no other. And what's so even more frustrating about this process is we see people who are embracing this, and we see people empowered by all the things we saw during a dark period of history, in my opinion, in this country.
So, Douglas, let me ask you, how has this nation dealt with previous, not just presidents, but politicians who have invoked anti-immigration rhetoric?
Well, the shame of a situation like this, and the historical versions of it too, are that usually presidents, when they talk this way, and there were, President Woodrow Wilson, who was our president just before World War I, was a open white supremacist. Interestingly enough, he showed less prejudice and bias toward many immigrants, but in some respects that was part of his sense that black people were deeply inferior, and that people who looked more white to him, though not all what we would call today white people, would have been white in his estimation. Woodrow Wilson, hugely racist person, but in reality, almost every president through the first half of the 20th century would have been a highly racist person. When you got close to after the Depression began, 1929 and early 1930s, you actually had President Hoover was an advocate of a Mexican repatriation program, and hundreds of thousands, we actually don't know exactly how many, but at a minimum, hundreds of thousands of Mexican families were forcibly taken back to Mexico, were required to go back. I mean, there really was a mass deportation. But what tends to happen over time is that when a president talks that way, they're reflecting the way that a lot of Americans think, that a lot of the majority population think. And then when the crisis passes, though, like in the case of President Wilson, well, once World War I began, well, then all of a sudden those Italian guys in New York City and a lot of African American guys down in Mississippi, where I'm from, well, suddenly they have value as soldiers. And so for a period of time, those attitudes recede, but then they come back again. But in the end, it's the job of a president to give voice to the highest principles and ideals of Americans and American values. And so the shame of the current moment is that you have a president who is expressing things that in reality the majority of Americans don't believe, but he's encouraging a minority of people who perhaps do to do things that we will all regret.
Go ahead, Antjuan.
Elaine, just one thought. We can't change the course of history. And yes, there were time periods in our history in which leaders used this type of rhetoric and behavior, and it was okay. But I think every generation has a responsibility to move this idea of the American experiment forward. The problem with Donald Trump and his rhetoric is that it speaks to and it tickles the ear of a number of people in this country, and I call that a silent majority. Let me tell you why. Regardless of whether you publicly say it's right or wrong, if you continue to support and wrap your arms around the idea or support Donald Trump, then you're just as guilty as he is, in my opinion, with some of the rhetoric he uses. And that's the problem, right? And we've seen what this type of rhetoric could do. I lived through Charleston, South Carolina not too long ago, 4 years to be exact, where my friend was killed in a church because Dylan Roof wanted to start a race war. Why? Because he felt empowered in an environment where certain actions and motives and certain words were okay to make him feel empowered to go into a church and kill 9 parishioners while they were worshiping their God. We've seen some of the activities over the past couple of years, and we've seen all this on the uptick and the rise post Donald Trump taking the Oval Office, Charlottesville, and I can point to so many examples, and that's the problem. And so when we call these things out, we have to essentially bury these things, and so that future generations will not repeat the sins of the past generation. I don't want to keep having the same conversations that my sharecropper grandparents did. I don't want my nieces and nephews to have to live in the country where if they have to worry about going to their church to worship, whether some white supremacist is going to come in and shoot up the church, or whether the leader of the free world they see on the evening news, or we're going to have discussions about whether he telling people to go back to where they come from, like we can read in the history book about people who look like me. That's the problem I have with all this. And for every Republican leader who wants to press the ignore button for political gain or for the political moment, shame on you, because you're going to have to answer for this at some point throughout in your lifetime.
Well, this is a conversation that no doubt will continue. It must continue. Douglas Blackmon and Antjuan Seawright, my thanks to both of you. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.